Okay, folks, we're going to put together the second presentation on the start of the Great Depression today. And without getting too deep into it, you saw some of the conditions that led to problems. But by the end of this presentation today, the crash has occurred and they're going to start moving forward. So just to give you an idea, as the conditions towards the crash are getting closer and closer. In 1929, the amount of money you made on the average in the northeastern part of the United States, think New York, think Boston, someplace like that, you're getting $921 a year. That's your per capita income. It may not sound like much, but compared to what an agricultural-based South Carolina resident was getting, they're getting by on $129 a year. And it doesn't sound very equal. I mean, obviously, it's going to be harder to rent an apartment or something in New York as far as your housing costs are concerned and whatnot. But still, $129 in South Carolina doesn't leave you a lot of room if the economy goes badly as far as how you're going to survive. In fact, farming was a big problem for the United States in the mid-1920s, towards the end of the 20s. During the war years, everybody had made a lot of money because there was a demand for food that needed to be exported overseas, supplied to soldiers, things like that. And so farmers made a lot more money. And of course, during that time, they went out and bought more land because they said, man, this is great. We're making more money than we ever have before. If I want to make more money, I just have to grow more. So they bought more land. They bought tractors. They bought other mechanized things to help them deal with whatever was produced. But unfortunately, that also meant that once the war was over and the prices came down, they were locked into these additional mortgage payments or payments for their tractor, for example. And so suddenly they had, less revenue coming in. And they still had the same expenses. On top of that, they also are going to lose quite a bit of their market if you're a grain farmer. Things like barley and hops and other things that are going to go into making beer. The Prohibition era is going to come in, and during Prohibition, you're not allowed to make beer. So suddenly, that large market, think like Budweiser, for example, is not going to be buying a lot of the stuff you produce if you're a grain farmer. And suddenly there's a lot less demand, which means, again, your price is going to drop. Also during the 20s, people are going to change how they eat a bit. The more society goes on, the more we're aware of what's good for us, what's not. Now it's more possible because of refrigeration and being able to ship things around the country. People are eating a little bit more meat. And of course, more meat requires, the animal to walk around, on a field and graze and that kind of thing. So they're not getting as much, although they're still getting plenty of grains. They're beginning to change how they eat. And so that's going to be going on. Like I said, tractors are going to be now more and more used, which means they need gasoline, they need oil. Instead of having a horse that pulls a plow, and you need, let's say, for instance, food grown for the horse that's going to pull the plow or the cow that's going to pull the plow, that's going to take away, again, something else that a farmer used to produce that would bring him income because now there's less demand for animal fodder. So they start looking around. They go, you know what? We can't use the same field every year in the same fashion. If you think back to when we were looking at what cotton did to soil. Cotton burned out the soil basically and used up all the nutrients. But, if you let a field lie fallow for a year or two, and you planted, let's say, 3/4 of your farm, and each year you rotated which quarter was not being used, it can replenish itself nutrient wise. And people started to learn this. They're starting to implement this. So they're also reducing the amount of acreage they're using out of what they own, which again is going to now reduce, what is produced, which I guess could be helpful, but you need less people to go out there and tend to the crops or harvest the crops or deal with the production of things once they're brought in, making them ready for market. So overall, wheat prices go from $2.50 a bushel down to $1. That's not just a 100% drop, or not 100% drop, but a 50% drop. That's more than a 50% drop. And then, again, if you're going from, let's say, year 1 to year 2, and you're trying to figure how you're going to pay for everything, and suddenly you're getting less than 50% of what you did before, it's going to be really difficult for you to make that mortgage payment or that tractor payment or simply keep up with the costs that you have. And again, because refrigeration and freezer cars for railroads and trucks are starting to be more and more used, now again, people start saying, all right, well, now I live in a city and I can get more milk. Ice cream is going to go up. and so that's going to be good for a milk producer. Fruits and vegetable people are going to start to see, I'm talking about the producers, are going to see a bigger market. But we do change how we're eating to more of what we think of today. Cotton farmers are also going to start to see a little bit of a reduction. Part of the problem there is that instead of having all cotton clothing, people are going to start to use other alternatives. And instead of as much cotton being used, you start looking at polyester, perhaps, or you start looking at other kinds of fibers that would be used for things that we wear. And so the cotton farmer is going to say, I've lost part of my market there. We also put our tariffs up pretty high. We saw that in the last presentation. And because of that, when we raise our tariffs, typically other people, raise theirs. That makes it harder for us to sell our products overseas. And while we are making it, because it's a trade war, because we are making it harder for people to sell their stuff here, they make it harder for us to sell our stuff there. And, right about this time is going on, we're thinking, oh, we've got them where we want them. The Soviet Union comes in there and they start selling agricultural products around the world at a really, really reduced rate. Side note, this is actually stuff that the Soviet people need. And there's going to be a mass famine in the Soviet Union because they sell food that's actually needed by the Soviet people. But the Soviet government wants the money so they can buy things they can't get elsewise. And it's going to cause a problem for the Soviet people. But in our case, because the Soviets are able to come in and say, we'll charge you, say, 30% less, and I'm making that number up, they're basically, going to make up for what we don't supply. And everybody happily buys from them nice and cheaply. And our tariff doesn't do a whole lot for helping us out much. So if you look at what, the farm prices, as far as what you're getting for goods, you see that number dropping from 1920 to 27. It does fluctuate, from 21 to 27. It goes up some. But the vast majority of farmers are actually working at an annual loss. For what they spend, they're not bringing in, enough to just cover their costs, let alone make a profit. And so farmers who are vital to, cities in particular, because people in the cities aren't growing their own food, they're on the verge of failure. And it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot going on to help them. Farmers are typically really not rich. They really have thin margins as far as what happens if there's any kind of a drought or hurricane, a flood, anything that happens whereby part of their crop is ruined. It can devastate them for years. Now do that for several years in a row, and it's even more disastrous. So skipping out more to the people with, lives in the city, they're making a little more money. And, they're looking at ways to get rich. And we saw this in the last presentation with people who were trying to speculate on land down in Florida, such as Miami and the condo that was selling for $4.5 million in the mid-20s. But everybody's thinking, oh, we can't possibly do anything except get rich. The stock market never does anything except go up. And it seemed impossible for the stock market to fail. There'd never been a big stock failure before. And so people would take what extra money they had, and they didn't put it into a bank necessarily and say, I'm going to collect interest on it, a savings account or something. They would go buy a share of stock. And if you don't know how shares of stock work, basically a company breaks itself up into small parts. Each one of those parts is called a share. And each share is whatever people value the company at. They divide it by the number of shares, and that's the share price. So if my company's worth, $1,000 and I divide it into 10 shares, each share would be $100. Now, if somebody looks at my company and says, man, this company is amazing, it's going to go places, they might be willing to spend more than $100 on that share and bid that price up. And when somebody buys that share for more than $100, the next time somebody wants to buy one, they look at, well, what was the last price somebody paid? Oh, it was $115. So let's say I'm sitting on my shares and I don't want to sell them. They say, I'll give you 100. Nah, last guy got 115. You have to do better than that. And they come along and they say, how about $130 a share? And I'll be like, all right, now you're talking. I might have only paid $100 for my share, but now because they gave me 130 for it, I'm getting $30 in extra profit. That's one of the two ways people typically make money in stocks. The other one is a few times a year, the company will look at how it's doing overall, and they'll divide their profits for that quarter, that 3-month period, and they'll divide it amongst all the shares of stock and send out a check to people in what's known as a dividend. And that way, you as the owner of the company are getting the profits. You get a dividend for every share you get, and the more shares you have, obviously, the higher your dividend payment is going to be. Now, because again, all the stocks were going up, some people came up with an ingenious scheme, as they always do in the financial world, to figure out some way to make more money. And what they thought they could do was, if a guy comes in and says, "I'd like to buy a share of stock of a company," you can get a loan from the bank in order to buy that share of stock. And that loan, the way that on margin buying was put together was that instead of paying 100% of the share of stock, which you have to do now, you only need to put down 10%. So, if a share is $100 and you walk in with $100, you might expect you're only going to get one share. But you don't want to be left out in this whole thing, because that share price is going to go up from $100. And because of that, you say, "Well, is there anything we can do?" And they say, "Well, tell you what, why don't you get a loan?" And you'll see how this works in just a moment. And you only have to pay for 10% of the share of stock. Technically, it's going to be yours. It's like when you buy a car and you put down down payment, you don't necessarily pay off the car. You have to pay it off over time, but you're expecting you're going to be able to do that. Same thing goes with the guy buying a share of stock on margin. He thinks he'll be able to pay back the share either, in the short term, or maybe when he sells it down the road for a huge profit. And he'll just pay the bank back and make a ton of money. So, you ask, well, wait a minute, what is the bank going to get out of this if the person can't pay? Well, again, stocks only go up, and banks think that all the time. So, they're going to come back and take the share of stock because, again, stocks only go up. They don't seem to fail ever. So stock prices are going up. And as stock prices are going up, people are making money because they paid for it down here. It is now worth what's up here. And that difference here, you just simply put in your pocket once you pay back the bank. So we have an example of that. So I made this up here. Montgomery Ward was a really, really good company to have in the 1920s. It's January of 1928. And a share in Montgomery Ward is $200. So let's say you have $1,000 and you could do option one. Hold on a second. Guys, I'm recording. Let's say you have $1,000 and you want to buy 5 full price shares. That makes sense. You spend your $1,000, you get 5 shares, $200 a piece. By the time you get to November of that same year, it's not $200 anymore for a share of stock. It's $439.85. So your $1,000 investment is now worth $2,199.38 because you only paid 10% of things. Now, if you sell everything at that particular point and pay back the bank the $1,000 you borrowed from them, you are going to have a profit of almost $1,200. It's less than a year when, again, the per capita income is less than that. That's fantastic. But again, if you do it with on margin buying, remember again, the share price is $200. 10% of that is $20. So if you do it on margin wise and you only pay 10%, you borrow the same $1,000 from the bank. Instead of being full price, you now are paying 10%. You get 50 shares and you only pay $20 a share. You still own them. You have to pay back the bank later on. Okay. But notice in this case, when you get to November 28, your investment's actually $21,993.75. You pay back the bank what you borrowed, okay? And now your profit is almost $17,000. You're trying to look at this and go, well, which one makes more sense to me? I mean, we know the punchline of the story of the Great Depression. But almost everybody was convinced that buying on margin made all the sense in the world. So, it's what you're going to do. I see my mistake I made earlier. You come in, basically, if you're looking at this example, you have $1,000 and you're going to borrow the rest from the bank. That's what you need to do. But overall, the profit numbers remain the same. This one's going to be $16,993.75, and everybody's going to think that's the option to go for. So like we told you before, radios were a big deal. It's how people are staying connected. It's how people are being entertained. And as a result of that, their RCA company is going to be formed, Radio Corporation of America. When they go public, they offer shares for the very first time. And you're going to see a couple of big things happen. The number of radio stations, by the way, that existed in 1922 In January of 22, there were all of 8. Okay. By July of that year, there's 76. By December, there's 500 plus. As far as sales of radios, so that you can pick up those signals and get that entertainment, $60 million in sales in 1922. By the time you get to 1929, people were spending $441 million in radios. They're a huge deal. So, that share of stock in the background is actually an RCA share of stock. Not that I have one, I don't. But here's the value of the stock. In 1921, it's $1.50 a share. Now, at one point, it gets a little bit expensive. Okay. In 1928, it goes up here to $420, which at the time is a huge sum of money. It's almost half of what the average person earns in a year. And it's basically unattainable for most people. When share prices get super, super high, one thing that companies often will do is they'll say, oh, okay, this has gotten crazy. And what they're going to do is make more shares. They're going to take one share and divide it into 4, or one share divided into 5, which they did here. They split it into a 5 for one share, essentially broken into 5. Each share is now $114.75. And that means it's really, really simple or easier for a person to buy a share, because now it's only $115, not $420. So you're going to go invest in it because, again, what's going to happen with RCA? It's going to go up. Number of radio stations, number of radios being bought. It's going to be a big deal. And again, you look at these numbers. There's just not a huge span of time where people see this stock market going up and up and up, and there can't be any change from that. So example number 2, General Electric, company still around today. If you bought General Electric in 1923, it's $196 a share. In 1924, it reaches a high point of $281. You could have easily sold it off, paid back the bank if you needed to, or just plowed the money back into the stock market. General Motors, $15 a share in 1923. In 1924, it's at 62.5. It's gone up 400%. Again, always are going up. And because they're always going up, people see it as absolutely safe. People see it as not risky, and they don't want to be left out. They want to make money because there's more things they want to buy. And we saw that in the form of like the electrical things before. So you've got to have money to spend if you want to get involved in stocks. Not every single person, and this is a really important thing that people often mistake. They think that everybody was playing on the stock market. That's not true. Okay. Out of 105 million Americans who lived at the time, only 1.5 million may have been involved in the stock market. So it wasn't like everybody in the country lost all their money in the stock market. It was just those who could afford to take some money. If you're barely getting by, you're not going to go, play the stock market. You got to worry about food or rent or clothes or healthcare or other things. And again, this is no different than what companies do today. But if you have a pension plan, and the company puts money into, a pension program for its employees for maybe a decade down the road, they're also going to invest so they can make more money. And companies like Bethlehem Steel and Electric Bond and Share, they have $157 million in the stock market, which represents pretty much the entire, retirement income that its retired workers are expecting to get once they retire. And that number, of course, while they're buying stocks because the company's pension plan is going to be worth more and more and more and more, of course, you can read the writing on the wall. We know that in 1929, the crash comes. And we know that anybody who's in the stock market generally lost a lot of money. And all those people who said, oh, the pension plan is going to allow me to retire and meet all my costs in my retirement for the next 20 years of my life, well, that's going to be wiped out virtually immediately. We don't need that one. And a famous story about the Kennedy family. Here you're seeing a picture over on the right-hand side. This is Joseph Kennedy, the patriarch of the Kennedy clan, John F. Kennedy's dad. John F. Kennedy is actually standing on the right side of the picture here, the younger-looking dude. The brother to the side of him is the one that was supposed to actually run for president down the road. Unfortunately, in World War II, he gets killed. His plane blows up in Europe. And, then the father basically says, well, it's going to be John's turn, basically. But Joseph Kennedy was an investor and a very, very rich dude. And he had a lot of money in the stock market. And basically, if you read the quote there on the side, read that quote on the side, he steps out for a shoe shine one day, kind of a lost art. And, the boy who's shining his shoes and buffing everything and putting on the polish and then buffing it out and everything else is actually giving him some stock tips on stuff that people have been talking about either to him or, like one guy's getting his shoe shined and the other guy's waiting. Stuff that he's been picking up and listening. And, this guy's giving him, pretty decent advice that he recognizes as being like, you know what, this guy, it's getting way too easy. Too many people are getting involved in this and everybody's trying to get rich. Everybody's throwing money in. So here's a secret about the stock market. There's a company out there that produces things, and let's call it Georgia Paper, okay? Real company. Georgia Paper is going to produce so much paper this year. If the stock price goes up, that doesn't change how much paper they're producing. It's just what people think it's going to be worth and how much the company's worth in general. When everybody's trying to get into the stock market and throw money in, they're bidding these prices up. That doesn't mean that the company is more profitable or less profitable. All it means is that people are willing to pay more and more and more for that particular thing, no matter what goes on. It doesn't change anything about the company except what its value seems to be. And when this guy, meaning Joseph Kennedy, is getting advice that makes sense from the shoeshine boy, he's like, you know what? I need to get out of the market. And he actually is going to liquidate almost all of his stocks. He had, like I said, a large sum of money in stocks, and he buys real estate right before the crash happens. As a result, the family money is preserved and allows him to be heavily involved in his son's campaign for first the House of Representatives and then the Senate and eventually the presidency in 1960. But had he not gotten out of the market when he did, there would have been no President John F. Kennedy, and we'd have a different history than we know today. And again, we had the housing speculation as another example of where people were going, I can't lose money. I'm going to invest in land down in Florida. Then, of course, the hurricanes show up. We saw that in the last presentation. Those who can are putting all the money they can into get rich things. And, it's really unfortunate, but, again, all it does is go up for the most part. And they don't see the problems coming. And, well, let's put it this way, they're going to. One of the problems is that, nobody's paying attention to banks. At this particular point in time, there is a federal program that we have today that didn't exist. The FDIC, if you were going to banks now, you would see a sticker on doors when you walk in for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation is a program run by the banks where they all pay essentially into an insurance fund. So if the bank fails, they're going to guarantee their customers' deposits up to a certain amount. And that gives people the confidence that if a bank fails, their money's not going to be lost. We learned that because of the Great Depression. People who had a large amount of money, could open their own bank, and people did. If you're familiar with the Christmas time movie, It's a Wonderful Life, Old Man Potter literally has his own bank. And, he charges crazy interest rates and, he does everything so that he's getting rich. He's not doing it for the benefit of the people. That's George Bailey's savings and loan program. But most banks around the United States, and I say most banks, were not a part of the Federal Reserve System. There were some national banks, large ones, like this little tiny bank right here in Texas in 1928. It's a single building, and takes care of the needs of the people locally. And at this time, a lot of people live in rural areas. They don't go to the big city. They don't trust big cities. They don't like big cities. And because of that, they tend to want to put their money in a local bank, expecting everything's going to work. And I know Tom, and Tom knows me. And if I'm late on a payment, Tom's going to let it slide. And I need to get a loan. I'm going to go see Tom. They're all very tight. But because you're buddies, you might overlook things. And things you might overlook might be, well, this guy also has a huge gambling problem, and if he's got to pay back a loan for his house and he gambles away his mortgage payment, you're not going to get your money back. That means when the other customer comes in who made the deposit that supposedly the bank has, but they loan it out to somebody else, when he comes in for his money, they're not going to be able to give it to him because, again, the guy gambled his money away. They're maybe not the best business people of all time. And because of that, local banks are going to fail. There are 30,000 local banks across the country with, no real governance whatsoever. Anything that goes wrong, they're going to be right on the forefront of it because, again, there's no insurance way to back anybody up if everything goes downhill. So, these local banks are operating on their own, and they might have all the savings of a local community tied up in their bank. But if they've got somebody who's unscrupulous, not trustworthy, non-helpful, in there, they might just give loans out because they're buddies with somebody and they don't look at whether or not the guy can actually pay it back. So bank-wise in the 1920s, you can see the number of banks that are here. In 1900, there's 14,000. 20 years later, there's almost 31,000. Okay, the population didn't just explode overnight. But now there's almost 31,000 banks. But what does that do for failures? Well, in 1921, there's 505 banks that fail. Okay, there's 367 in 22. But the average number of failures from 23 to 29, which is a 7-year period, is almost 700 apiece. So that's 7 times 7 years. So that's 4,900 banks right there. They're going to fail in that time frame. We don't, 4,900, let's say that's, 300 more. So that's 5,200. It's 5,700 banks that are going to fail, roughly over this time period of 1921 to 29. That's a pretty large number. It's representing a huge, chunk of what's going on in there. So nobody's paying attention to the fact that these little banks are loaning money out too much without any kind of collateral or checking on what people's credit is, or what that's going to mean in a larger picture if one bank can't work and then another bank can't work and another bank can't work and you got problems. In Louisiana, the state banking commissioner made this statement at one point. I believe it's 25. Talking about the problems of the era: gross and evil management, poor management, promotion of speculative enterprises, things like get-rich-quick schemes. Oh, you got to try this. Banks were involved in this. Loans without security. Like, what are you going to give me if the thing fails? To large loans. Loans to companies in which the bank officers were interested. So, my guy works at the bank and he's also on the board of a local, business, and he says, I think I'm going to go to my bank and get a loan. Well, of course he's going to vote to give himself a loan. He's working for the bank and the other business. That's not seen as a problem at the time. But, he's going to think, oh, there's nothing go wrong. I'm involved with it. And again, there are people that fail. And these were reasons banks were failing across the United States for all these kinds of reasons right here. So if we're looking at what was going on in the economy in the 1920s leading up to the big crash, you get, number one, everybody's spending money. All the electrical goods, for instance, cars. You get people buying things with credit they don't have. You get people who are used to paying for things in cash. Then they start saying, oh, we'll just pay for it later, and then the bill might become due. Foreign economies can't buy our stuff because they're wrecked economically after World War I. And, then we are going to say, why don't you buy our stuff? Well, we're going to make your stuff more expensive. And they say, no. We're not going to buy your stuff either. So if we run out of customers, for instance, for radios in the United States, we're hoping maybe we'll sell overseas. And they're like, no, you made a tariff on our stuff. We're going to make a tariff on your stuff. And now we can't sell our stuff over there either. We continue to make radios. We continue to make other things thinking that, just somebody's going to buy them. And we keep paying workers to produce things that realistically are going to sit on a shelf and not sell. That's going to be a problem. The more of a supply of something there is, the lower in value it's going to cost, such as food. Land speculation, like in Florida, people bidding up the price of land and, thinking that there's nothing that's going to go wrong. And then there's stock speculation. Everybody's thinking that, they're going to get rich and they're borrowing money from banks, money they don't have, so that they can own shares of stock. And then lastly, of course, the really, really inadequate banks that had really, really poor controls. These things are going on throughout the 1920s. And it's all going to come to a collapse in October of 29. So in 1926, the building industry actually started slowing down. And the building industry is responsible for not only building buildings, of course, but they are going to be buying lumber, and they're going to be buying nails, and they're going to be buying roofing materials. They're going to be employing people who, buy groceries. And when the construction industry starts going downhill, there's not as many people making money. And that should have been a sign that something was coming, but people didn't pay attention to that. People weren't going to build large skyscrapers because they're like, I don't know about this, and again, that turned the economy into a softer one than people were used to. In June of 29, estimates showed that people were expecting a lot of things to potentially go downhill. Factory output went down. So a factory that's been making, let's say, a lot of radios is slowing down. Why are they slowing down? Somebody should have asked. Is this happening in any other industry? Somebody should have asked, but they didn't. And they're just like, it's no big deal. It's just cyclical. It's going to come back up. It always does. Steel production goes down. Wait a minute. Steel is used to build railroads for the railroad engines, but also the tracks. Things like large buildings. They should have been looking at these signs, but they didn't. And some people did look at some what's going on. They're like, I don't like what's going on. And they began to say, you know what, I need to start selling some of my stock. I don't want to be left holding the bag if the value of a company goes down because their factory output went down or something else. And when one guy sells his, somebody notices, hey, wait a minute, that company's being sold for less than usual. That's kind of weird. That might cause somebody else to then say, I need to cash out as well. And that starts a ripple effect, which, starts getting worse. Oh boy. This guy right here, Roger Babson, in September of 29, a month before, everything goes crazy, he says, sooner or later, a crash is coming and it may be terrific. It gets reported in the press. As soon as it gets reported in the press, people who are like really, really nervous about their money, they say, oh no, let's go sell. And they go and they start selling their shares. And as a result of them selling all of their shares, the stock market goes down about 3% just because he comes out and says, I think something kind of bad is coming. It just takes one guy making a prediction and people go, oh no. And first guy sells, and the second guy goes, it's coming true. And he sells his. And it stabilizes, but it goes down 3% just because he thinks it might go downhill. In the fall of 1929, even President Hoover is a little bit concerned. He's a self-made millionaire. He's a good guy. He even tells people, I'm thinking things are looking kind of weird. He's going to start selling a lot of his stuff off so that, he's not going to be left holding the bag. If he bought stocks at 100, he doesn't want to be selling it for 85 and taking it a loss. And notice, here's the guy over here, John J. Rascom. He's writing for the Ladies' Home Journal. He wanted to tell people how to get rich. And he thought the way to do that is by buying stocks in the stock market. He says, spend $15 a week in stocks. In 10 years, you'll be worth $80,000. And he makes some suggestions on things that people should buy. Quietly on the side, the things he's telling people to buy in his magazine article around the country are the things that he has. And he wants people to buy his because he wants to sell out. Now we would call that insider trading. He'd be going to prison for sure. But he's trying to bump up, his profits, selling them because he tells people, oh, this is going to be great down the road. Nobody knows they're buying his stocks. They just know they're going through a stockbroker because a stockbroker takes one guy over here and says, I've got his share of stock. And meanwhile, this person wants to buy it. And the stockbroker is the guy in the middle who makes it happen. He doesn't say, yeah, you're actually buying David Trail's stock, just to tell you. So he's selling his stuff off and making money off of people who don't know any better because they're reading his articles, and he told them to do this. And as far as I'm concerned, he should have gone to prison. Between May of 28 and 29, again, everything keeps going up. And it follows the trend that everybody has been expecting for so long. Everything's going up in general, a little slight burp there at one point, but everything's going up. And you see it goes up by 40%. A share of stock on the average goes up by 40% in value between May of 28 and September of 29. And if you've heard of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, that's the cost of one share of stock of the leading companies in America, a certain number of them. And if you added, let's say Boeing and AT&T and Disney, and you get one share of each, what they all cost combined is what the Dow Jones Industrial Average is. So that equivalent in 1929 doubled in value during that time frame. Didn't say 40%. That one doubled. Everybody, again, is looking to saying, we can't help but make money in the stock market. So they continue to pour money in. And they keep going to the banks and they keep saying, we'd like to buy some stock and we're going to do it on margin. So, we'd like to get loans for it. And you can see the loans for investors in December 27 were $3.5 billion. By 1929, people borrowed $6 billion from the bank to go off and buy stocks because everything always goes up and never comes down, right? Problem. So it's going to sound weird when we're talking about 20,000 being the norm today in the United States. But back then, in September of 1929, the what we would call today the Dow Jones Industrial, the NYTI, was at 381.17. The Federal Reserve looked around and said, there's too many people borrowing money. We got to slow things down. The economy's too hot. It's going to lead to inflation, blah, 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 blah. And when they start making money harder to get, loans are harder to get, for example, investors look at that and they say, whoa, 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 why is the Federal Reserve slowing things down? Or maybe they know something we don't know. And so people start selling off their stocks. John starts selling his stocks. Mary starts selling hers because she sees John doing that. I see Mary doing that. I sell mine. Henry over here is going to sell it. It's a chain reaction kind of thing. And by the end of the month, the companies themselves, these leading companies, had lost about $2.8 million in value. Did it change how much they actually made in terms of profits? No. Did it change how much they actually produced? No. It's just what the value of the company was amongst all the people who own shares added combined. What are they worth? And, it's not changing anything but the company's direction. But again, people are feeling a little nervous at first because they see other people doing it, but it's not the big one. So just to put it out there, in 1925, all the stocks combined, every share combined, all the companies combined, were worth $27 billion. In October 29, all the companies that had broken themselves into publicly traded shares were worth something that doesn't come up there. It's not good. A lot. I want to say it's more than $100 million. $100 billion, that is. Now we come to October of 1929. The first of the really bad days was Black Thursday. Almost 13 million shares of stock. Remember, each one represents one small piece of a company. 13 million shares of stock sell in that one particular day. It is a day unlike any other. The previous record for the most shares sold in one day was 4 million. This is more than 3 times that. Again, it starts a panicky sale. If I bought the stock at $100 and I hear it's going for 90, it'll come back. It's not a big deal. I hear it's at 80 and I might freak out. I'm like, whoa, I don't want to lose all my money. So I might be willing to sell it at 80, and then somebody's going to buy it from me, for example. But then maybe there's somebody else who goes, they're even more desperate and they're going to cash out at 70. And what the last price was is where things kind of start. So that term points equals dollars. Some shares of stocks drop $10, $20, $30 in price. And again, we're talking about 1929, not 2020. And when they're dropping by $30 a share in one day, that's absolutely astronomical in terms of, the up and down fluctuation. So as far as Black Thursday is concerned, there's a group of major investors that meet together in a very, very worried setting. Like, oh my goodness, what's going on? Nothing like this has ever happened. People are panic selling because they saw everybody else selling. And they say, let's reassure everybody. We think it's a good idea. They take their large sums of cash that they have and they start buying up stocks. And the price sort of settles and starts to go back up a little bit, because they're willing to buy everything that people are willing to sell. And that gives people confidence. Oh, these rich guys know what's going on. Let's follow their lead. And you can see the downplaying of it. There's been a little distress on the stock market. For the day, after 13 million shares trade hands and everything else, the stock market only loses 10 points. It's not a big deal. Every time a sale is made, though, it has to be publicly recorded and reported. And the trading day then is over at 3. It's later now, I think 4:30 now. But, the ticker tape is still spitting out all the trades that were going on. And it finally finishes 4 hours later as far as being caught up with all the sales that were going on. Now, what happens after a day like this? You still got one day left in the work week. Well, Friday is going to show up. Okay, this is the Thursday newspaper evening edition. Wall Street in a panic as stocks crash. If you think that sounds bad, wait to see what's coming. Friday is relatively calm. A little bit of trading on Saturday. There's a half day on Saturday at noon. But on Monday, October 28th, everybody's been looking around saying, the signals are looking bad and things are going to start selling again. Now, in this case, $1.4 billion in stock values will be lost. Again, that's just what people value the companies at. It's not, again, tied to their profits. It's not tied to how much they're producing. But it's $14 billion in the values of these major companies are going to be wiped off the books. It's all what people are willing to pay for it. If I was to take a sheet of paper and hold it up and say, what's a sheet of paper worth? And you're like, it's a sheet of paper, like 2 cents. And I said, well, what if it's a signed document signed by, George Washington? Suddenly it's valuable to you. It's what people are willing to pay for it. And that's how stocks work. So Monday's bad. Monday's bad, but Tuesday's the big one. Within 30 minutes of the opening bell in Wall Street, 3.2 million shares get sold. Again, the previous record ever was basically 13 million in a day. They do 3 million in 30 minutes. 8.3 million are sold by lunch. 16 million. Everybody's trying to get out. The previous day, the stock market went down 13%. The next day, the stock market goes down almost 12%. $15 billion in the values of companies are going to be gone at this point.
As the Roaring Twenties were drawing to an end, so too was an era of relative prosperity for many Americans. As early as 1926, the construction of new housing had decreased. Businesses had too much inventory and too few buyers. Nevertheless, an optimistic America wanted to believe that the good times would last forever, pointing to fortunes that were being made on the stock market. Even people with little money to spare wanted in on the action, and stockbrokers readily agreed to sell shares on margin, where they would lend citizens money to buy stock. These investors figured the stock's price was bound to go up and up, allowing them to pay back the stock's original price tenfold. The constantly rising price of stocks cast a spell over the nation. Noon-hour traffic stood still as people eagerly awaited news of their improved finances. Even distinguished Yale University economist Irving Fisher made a bold speculation.
The nation is marching along a permanently high plateau of prosperity.
But the simple fact was that the price paid for many stocks was unduly out of proportion to the actual profitability of the companies who issued them, creating the illusion of increased value. On October 29, 1929, reality finally caught up with the stock market, and what went up came crashing back down. Panicked investors sold 16 million shares in a single day, many for just pennies a share. Millions of other stocks went unsold entirely on that afternoon, known as Black Tuesday. In just a matter of hours, the stock prices took such a nosedive that any gains made over the previous year vanished. The market's collapse was the most distressing downturn in the history of the New York Stock Exchange. So distressing, in fact, a number of investors committed suicide rather than face financial ruin. Black Tuesday may have signaled the start of the Great Depression, but the collapse of the stock market wasn't the only cause of the nation's financial woes. The federal government of the 1920s had supported big business with low interest rates and very little governmental regulation, especially over the stock market. In turn, many businesses borrowed more money to expand than they could ever afford to repay. High tariffs that had kept American business owners happy because they kept foreign-made products out of the U.S. unfortunately meant many European countries were unable and increasingly unwilling to buy American-made products. For instance, Germany was barely able to pay the World War I reparations she owed, and high tariffs like the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, passed by Congress in 1930, only made matters worse. The tariff's goal was to protect American farmers and manufacturers, but it backfired. America found itself unable to sell her farm goods and manufactured products abroad. World trade in turn faltered as foreign countries imposed severe tariffs of their own in retaliation. Many key industries were struggling even before Black Tuesday. Throughout the boom times of the Roaring Twenties, agriculture had been in a tailspin. The textile, steel, automobile, and railroad industries were also beginning to feel the pinch. As the unemployment rate increased, most families bought even less. The gap between the handful of wealthy Americans and the rest of the population got even wider. Even though most Americans had not profited from the economic boom of the 1920s, they bought many exciting new products and services during this era of unrestricted credit, living well beyond their means. The banking industry, too, was hard hit. Some banks had invested heavily in the stock market and helplessly stood by as that money vaporized into thin air. As Americans began to realize the pitiful state of the troubled economy, many panicked and rushed to withdraw their savings from banks. Many banks simply couldn't instantly produce the cash demanded, and instead shut their doors, leaving depositors with nothing. Bank failures wiped out nearly 9 million individual savings accounts. 659 banks were closed in 1929, and by 1933, 1/4 of America's banks had failed.
So obviously that's a example of how things went down. And you can see the crowds over here on Black Tuesday waiting outside the stock market, trying to find out how things are going. If you had money, $10, $100, $1,000 that you put into it, did I just lose all my money? Or did I sell it in time to get some of my money back? These people are a little bit concerned about what's going on. Wednesday, they take the day off. Black Tuesday is horrible. Wednesday, they're like, we're not going to meet at all. It's an emergency. They start, do it again on Thursday, thinking maybe things have stabilized. Nope. People start just immediately bailing out, then, trying even more to get out what's going on. By the time you get to the end of the month of October, some $50 billion in the values of various companies are just going to be wiped off the books, which is more than the United States spent on all of World War I. If you look at this guy over here in the picture, $100 buys this car. Look at how he's dressed. He's got a nice suit on. He's got a nice hat. He's got his cufflinks out there. That's a really nice car for that era. $100 will buy this car, must have cash. He lost everything on the stock market. He's probably got a bank he's got to pay back for buying things on margin, or maybe he bought a house that he can't afford, but he has to repay those banks or they're going to foreclose on things. And they don't want to have property because they don't want to have to pay for upkeep on it. They're going to want to sell it to somebody, but nobody's going to be able to buy it because they don't have money either. And as you saw in the video, it said that some people are going to commit suicide. They don't know how they're going to pay for things. Some people have life insurance policies and think that will keep their families afloat if they kill themselves. But it's the beginning of, a very devastating period, of course, known as the Great Depression. And you can see the share prices and how they are September 3rd to 29, and where they are November 3rd. They've lost $100 in value off American Can. General Motors goes down by half. Montgomery Ward goes down to a third of what it was. RCA is going to go down to a quarter of what it was, basically. All these companies are going to lose tremendous amounts of value in their share prices. And again, it doesn't mean people aren't buying or selling any less. It's just that's what people's investments had dwindled down to. You can see examples of people like rushing to the banks here, trying to go in and get their money. If you deposited money in the bank, you got paid $100 and you used $30 for groceries and you put $70 into the bank. I want to go get my $70 out before the bank fails. You go in there and they say, well, we loaned it to somebody and they haven't paid us back yet. And we can give you $10 and that's all we have left. The guy behind you is going to get nothing. These banks fail and there's no recourse for that because again, unless you were a large national bank, you weren't somebody who was looked at very heavily by the government. All these on-margin loans that people have been getting have to be repaid. Businesses that borrowed money to buy food for restaurants or to produce cars or whatever else, they can't operate without a line of credit to go buy the supplies they need. So they're going to fail. They lay off their workers. Their workers can't buy groceries and their workers can't pay their rent. Everything else is going on. And because they're not buying things, then less cars are being made. Less cars being made equals more people get laid off. It's kind of a familiar situation at the moment. So I'll post this separately over here. But President Hoover, for his part, at first doesn't realize how bad the situation is. We've had what are called panics in the past in American history, times when, economically things didn't go so well. And we recovered from those in about a year or so. The country itself, nothing has really changed. Just as some people made some bad investments. But what is the net effect going to be in the long run is the big question. And that's something we've never confronted before. Hoover tells the public the fundamental business of a country, the production and distribution of commodities, is on a sound and prosperous basis. And he's not wrong. There's still food in the grocery stores. Okay. Can people afford to buy it is the question. Are people getting paid for jobs? Do people have jobs? It's a question mark we're going to see in the next presentation. You can see this rather well-dressed lady right here with a fur. She's trying to buy apples or trying to sell apples, just simply to get by and bring in a little income. But, we're in for a very bumpy ride in the 1930s through the Great Depression. That's it for this one. With this one and the last one, equal what you need for the reading check for the week. Good luck with that. We'll see you soon.